Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Matt Covington with the Karst Waters Institute, and I'd like to invite you to the third talk in our new Frontiers in Karst Colloquium. And as many of you know, we're exploring a series of talks on the theme of carbonate critical zone processes, which will be continuing today. And if you missed either of these other talks and they look interesting to you, then feel free to go to the Karst Waters Institute webpage where they're available via YouTube. So those are still up there for you to see. And just a couple of organizational things. So we do plan to continue on with this talk series next semester. This is the last talk for the fall, but we plan to have 3 more talks next semester. And after I introduce the speaker here, we'll let her get started. And then the way we will handle questions in the end is everyone can enter their questions in the chat, and we'll read those out to Jessica. Okay. So our speaker today is Dr. Jessica Oster from Vanderbilt. And Jessica got her BA in geology from Oberlin in 2003. And then she continued on with a PhD at UC Davis and finished that up in 2010, where she stayed on in California at Stanford for a postdoc for a couple of years before she started as a professor at Vanderbilt in 2012. And I see that she actually just got tenure last year at Vanderbilt, so we can congratulate her on that. And without further ado, I'm excited to hear what Jessica has to tell us today.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Let me share my screen. Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys today. As you saw with my title, I'm going to be talking about work that I've been doing for a number of years, aimed at trying to apply a reactive transport framework to understanding how the chemistry of water evolves as it moves through the Karst system. And I come at this work from the perspective of a paleoclimatologist. My main research is using speleothems to reconstruct climate of the past. But I've really enjoyed and learned a lot from this particular project, in particular because it's been a chance to work in a really interdisciplinary way. This work is a very, very close collaboration with Jennifer Druin from the University of Illinois, who is a wizard with reactive transport modeling, and also with Corey Lawrence from the USGS, who is a specialist in soil carbon and also does a lot of reactive transport modeling. The 3 of us were postdocs together, are overlapping a little bit at Stanford with Kate Maher, and have been talking about these ideas since then. And they've really blossomed into, I think, a really cool project. This work has involved a number of different students. Aaron Covey was a student at Vanderbilt who pioneered a lot of the field work here. Max Gianetta, and unfortunately I don't have a picture of Max, so I'm representing him by the experiment that he ran for us at the University of Illinois. And then a number of different students have helped with this field work throughout the years, from high school students, grad students, undergrads, and postdocs. A lot of time underground collecting the data set that I'm going to show you today. So I mentioned that I come at this work from the perspective of a speleothem paleoclimatologist. So I thought I'd take a brief moment to motivate why speleothem records are so cool and why doing this kind of interdisciplinary work in the modern system is so important. Speleothems are great paleoclimate recorders because they exist in a number of low latitude and mid-latitude regions where humans live today and where they evolved. So we can learn a lot about our climatic history from speleothem records. And you can see from this map down here, that's from a recent publication by Laia Comasbrew and many, many other people that represents the most recent iteration of the SISL database the broad coverage of speleothem records from the literature. All of those purple symbols that you see are published speleothem stable isotope records that are included in the SISL database. So you can see the broad range of coverage, and the background map, the gray shading, is karst aquifers. So you can also see the potential that's out there for generating new speleothem paleoclimate records. Another thing that makes speleothem so helpful is that we can measure many different geochemical parameters along their growth axes. And this gives us opportunities to reconstruct many different aspects of the past climate system. And then critically, we can also date them at high precision using uranium thorium and provide a good chronology for those paleoclimate records that we develop. But any person who does this kind of work will tell you that in order to interpret the records that you develop, you need to have a solid understanding of the modern system. So the blue symbols that you see on the map are places where cave monitoring studies have taken place. And I know that this is not an exhaustive one, in particular because I don't see some of my own studies on there. But these studies in the modern environment allow us to develop an interpretive framework to sort of hang our paleoclimate records on. And so that's where the work that I'm going to talk to you about today comes in. From a critical zone standpoint, karst systems, as we've been talking about in this group, for a number of weeks, are really important and exciting because we have the opportunity to get inside of them, and we can sample water that has interacted with soils and host rocks and along a number of different flow paths. So we can intercept that water at a point in its journey through the critical zone, and we can analyze it. From a speleothem perspective, I mentioned that, a question that we ask is, how does water chemistry evolve as it moves through the karst critical zone? So these cave monitoring studies are the way that we get at that. And then what implications does this have for interpreting our paleoclimate records from cave deposits? So these monitoring studies are achievable on, the season, the time scale that we're able to observe these systems. So seasonal to interannual timescales. I think the longest cave monitoring studies are approaching, a decade at this point, maybe longer. But the records that we develop from speleothems are telling us about climate that happens on annual, maybe to millennial timescales or longer. So how do we apply what we can observe in the modern system to an understanding of these very long timescales? And Jenny and I were approaching this problem asking, can models help us bridge this gap? So the system that we're going to be working in is in Tennessee, Blue Spring Cave in Middle Tennessee. Tennessee is a very, very cavey state in the US, and our cave is located right in the caviest county of that state. So lots of cool opportunities to do work underground in Tennessee. We've been tracking the rainwater chemistry through the soil water and into the drip water in this cave zone, in this cave for a number of years, asking the question, can we model chemistry evolution through this karst critical zone and constrain it using our measurements of the cave seepage water? Blue Spring is the longest cave in Tennessee, at least I think so. And here you see a map of just part of it. Like many caves in this region, there's an impermeable caprock on top. So we only have water flowing through parts of the cave. And our sampling route takes us through the entrance, back under the caprock into this dry part of the cave, and then back sort of skirting the outside along the hill slope to the upper pool room and the cathedral room. And so this is where most of our data come from. We've measured a number of different things in this system. We've set up lysimeter arrays, gas well arrays. We've looked at the bedrock chemistry, soil chemistry, drip water chemistry, and I'll talk through a lot of what we've measured in a second. But one thing that's really valuable about this cave for our purposes is that it's also well loved by cavers. It's on private land, but it's been very extensively mapped and georeferenced. So we have a good sense of the thickness of the overburden and the height of the cave ceiling. So this is a profile along our sampling route. The red spots are everywhere where there's a ceiling height measurement. And you can tell that back here where most of our drip water measurement is happening, we're dealing with a very thin overburden. So our model domain is only about 12 meters. Here's a schematic of our monitoring setup. We've got weather station, precipitation and temperature, an array of gas wells at multiple depths, soil lysimeters collecting water at a couple different locations at different depths. Inside the cave, we've grown modern calcite on artificial substrates. We've put out a number of drip rate loggers. We measure cave air, temperature, humidity, and CO2 at many locations. And then we are looking at the chemistry of these waters. For the soil, water, and gas, we're focusing on carbon isotopes, stable and radiocarbon. For drip water, we've looked at oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon isotopes of the DIC, both stable and radiocarbon, and then elemental cation ratios as well. Okay, so here's what we see when we look at the cave air. We've been measuring the cave air PCO2 temperature and humidity at many locations close to the cave entrance and then further back near where we sample the drip water. Here we've got the air temperature on the surface in the black, so you can see that strong seasonal signal. And you can see that in the cave, that signal is very muted. The red line is our closest to surface or closest to the entrance measuring station. And it shows some seasonality, but as you move further back in the cave, we really stop seeing that kind of temperature variation. If we look at PCO2, again, when we look close to the entrance, the numbers approach near surface PCO2 in the winter months and rise during the summer. There's a lot of evidence here for winter ventilation, which is something we see in mid-latitude caves quite frequently. During the summer months, CO2 will seep into the cave through the soil zone, through these fractures. And during the winter, we have density-driven ventilation where the cave is warmer than the outside surface. That cold surface air with low PCO2 will sink into the cave and overturn some of the air in the cave. So we start to see mixing in of low PCO2 surface air in the winter months. We've also looked at drip rate at a number of different sites, and we think we've identified two main characteristics of our drip sites. I'd like to point out that some of our drip rate studies have been done through an outreach effort that I've had the ability to collaborate with at Vanderbilt. We have this wonderful program called the School for Science and Math at Vanderbilt that brings high school students from Nashville Public Schools to campus 1 day a week for all 4 years of their high school experience to learn science and do research in labs with different PIs. I had the ability to work with a team of 4 sophomore women for a whole year, and we did this really extensive drip rate study in the upper pool room of the cave. So they built Arduino drip rate loggers and deployed them and analyzed the data, and it was a lot of fun. And we found that we really do see 2 different kinds of drip characteristics. We have sites such as this one, BSW4, which stands for Blue Spring Water, that shows some variability in response to rainfall, but throughout the year we have fairly steady drip rates, very muted response to surface events. And then we have sites such as these, GENC are the initials of our high school students. And here we see what we're characterizing as more fracture flow. We have rainfall events, and within hours, we see a response in the drip rate within the cave. And these are the kinds of drips that will also dry up during our fall dry season as well. So we think we're sampling at least 2 broad kinds of drips within the cave. Okay, so Jenny and I approached this by basically dividing our project into 2 pieces. First, we looked at the carbon isotopes, and then we looked at the elemental ratios or the trace elements. Those of you who are on this talk and who are familiar with speleothem records know that carbon isotopes can be really complicated in speleothems. And you might be surprised to hear that what we found in Blue Spring is that the trace elements are actually way more complicated than the carbon isotopes. So I'm going to start by talking about the carbon story, as it really gave us a baseline and a framework for developing the reactive transport model. So here is most of our carbon isotope data for this system. So there's a lot of data on this slide. Here we've got our drip water delta 13C, and then net rainfall is down here at the bottom, and the gray shading is winter, December, January, February. So our effective rainfall is higher in the winter generally at this site. And we see our fracture fed sites, such as these blue and brown lines. They tend to have more negative delta 13C in the summer, or I'm sorry, in the winter months when the effective rainfall is higher values at other times of the year, and much larger ranges of variability. Our diffuse fed drip sites like BSW4 and 10, the red and the green lines, generally show less negative delta 13C values, lower ranges of variability. So that kind of suggests, more host rock buffering potentially at these drip sites. If we look over to the soil, LO3, 4, and 5, lysimeter 3, 4, and 5 are the ones stationed directly above the place where we sample a lot of this water. We see that the delta 13C decreases with depth. In our deepest lysimeter, we see some evidence of this lower value during the winter months as well. And I should mention that all of the soil water and soil gas radiocarbon came out modern. If we look to the radiocarbon for the drip water, we see a large range of variability, not a clear seasonal signal in there. But if we look at these green dots, these are our diffuse fed site. It shows a lot less variation than the other fracture fed sites. And if we look over to our soil gas and cave air, we believe that the cave air is a mixture of gas that's seeping in from the soil zone and atmospheric CO2. The cave air CO2 also has a modern radiocarbon age. And so really we don't think we see evidence of degassing of DIC contributing a large amount of CO2 to the cave air, but mostly seeping in of modern soil gas from the soil zone. Now, delta 13C and speleothems, as I mentioned, is thought to be complex. People interpret it sometimes as signals from the soil making it through, changes in respiration potentially that are driven by changes in aridity or temperature, changes in the plant community above the cave on long time scales, C3 or C4 plants. There's a contribution of host rock dissolution, the degree of connectivity through the epikarst with the soil gas, and a process called PCP, or prior calcite or carbonate precipitation, which is related to degassing and precipitation of calcite that happens anywhere upflow of the place where your speleothem is or your drip water is being sampled. So the degassing of the lighter C12 isotope will act to raise the carbon isotope signature of your DIC reservoir. And so this is something that is related to residence time, aridity, and cave ventilation as well. All right, so let's transition to talk about building the model. So Jenny built this model using the algorithm CrunchTope. And we have a lot of constraints on our model system from our measurements of the Blue Spring environment, but there were still some things we needed to figure out. So Jenny and Max undertook a batch dissolution experiment with a measured piece of the Blue Spring limestone to generate the kinetic components that would go into the model. So here you see the result of that experiment with calcium concentrations and the rate law that we were able to fit to those experimental results. So this gave us the rate constant and the solubility of this particular limestone. If we come over here, we see the setup for our 1D reactive transport model. We have a soil boundary condition with a delta 13C set by what we measure in our deepest lysimeter and a modern delta 14C. We flow this water through an epikarst with a composition based on our measured limestone, including the delta 13C and 14C. And then this emerges into a cave boundary condition where we could force degassing, we could include interaction with the gas phase as well. So, we began by realizing that we don't really know what the flow rate is through here. So we started at a number of different flow rates. So here you see 3 different simulations at different flow rates: fast, moderate, and slow. The fast rate corresponds to the water traversing the epikarst in about 17 days, the slow flow rate to about 67 days. And the yellow bars show you the range of measured values we have in our drip water in terms of calcium and radiocarbon. And so you can see with this breakdown here, with all of these flow rates at the moment, we're getting to where we need to be in terms of calcium, but we're very negative when it comes to radiocarbon. So we tried a number of different PCO2s constrained by the measured PCO2 in our soil gas wells. So that was a high soil PCO2. Here's a more moderate soil PCO2, and that's going to limit our reactivity and the amount of limestone that we dissolve. So you can see this actually moves us, out of the range that we measured in terms of our calcium, but steps us closer to our more modern radiocarbon value that we measure in the drip water. And then you can see at the lowest soil PCO2 we measured in the soil, the same kind of trends. So Jenny and I looked at this for a long time and we're like kind of beat our heads against the wall. Like, how do we reconcile these radiocarbon values with this calcium concentration to get to where we need to be and what the system is telling us is happening? And eventually Jenny had kind of a eureka moment and took a look at the gas diffusivity throughout the model. We were using a value that's more typical of the tortuosity that you have in pore spaces. And she tried using a diffusivity that's more characteristic of free air. So this would mimic more free communication between the soil zone and the water in the epikarst, allowing exchange along the whole flow route. And when we do this, here's what we get. So enhanced gas transport. We are able to enhance the communication of that modern soil gas with the drip water. And this pulls our radiocarbon values towards more modern values. And now many of our simulations, many of our combinations of flow rate and PCO2 bring us into the values that we're measuring in the drip water. Now, next, we're taking a look at the stable carbon isotopes. So this is without any stable isotope fractionation. When you add stable isotope fractionation in for the DIC species, we can take a look at our delta 13C. We see that we are, again, matching the range of values that we see in the drip water, with the exception of some values that are less negative that we measure in the drip water. So if we take a look in a different way, now here we've plotted on the x-axis our radiocarbon, and on the y-axis our delta 13C. And up here, these yellow dots are measurements for which we have both of these parameters constrained. Down here are our model simulations, and this is if we don't have any stable isotope fractionation. So we're essentially looking at a mixing between a soil, gas, and a limestone for both of these isotope systems. If we add in our stable carbon isotope fractionation, we jump up here. So now our simulations are here at our 3 different PCO2s, low, medium, and high, and our 3 different flow rates, slow, medium, and fast. And you can see that our measurements really fit within the zone where we have low to moderate PCO2, slow to medium flow rates. And if we were to allow degassing and secondary carbonate precipitation, this would move us upward on our delta 13C axis. And we do have some measurements that plot up here. So what we think we're seeing is that, we can explain a number of our measurements without invoking any kind of degassing, but with this stable isotope fractionation, gas exchange in the epikarst, and dissolution of the bedrock. And then if we assume that we have some amount of degassing that likely happens, not in the epikarst, but potentially as this water emerges into the cave, then we're able to move our water in the direction that accounts for some of our least negative carbon isotope measurements. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next little bit of time discussing the trace element side of this story. And I mentioned that we thought this would be the simple one, and it ended up being the more complex one. Trace elements are also often used to look at this process of prior carbonate precipitation in speleothems. It is because of the distribution coefficients of elements such as strontium, magnesium, and barium in calcite. As calcite is precipitated upflow, these elements will tend to stay in the drip water, and the more that's precipitated, the more enriched your drip water becomes in strontium, magnesium, and barium over calcium. Often this is used as a proxy of aridity, where if you have a higher net rainfall, you'll have faster flow, faster drip rates, and less carbonate precipitation happening, and vice versa. But this can also be influenced by cave ventilation and changes in cave air PCO2. So Daryl Tremaine published this several years ago, but it's a nice kind of summary of the idea behind it, where if you can constrain the sources of the magnesium and strontium to your water, like your host rock, for instance, and if PCP is happening and is important in your drip water or your speleothem, you would expect your waters to evolve along these arrays, where you would get enrichment in both strontium and magnesium as more PCP is happening. So we can plot our Blue Spring data on these similar cross plots. So here we've got natural log magnesium, calcium, and strontium, calcium for our Blue Spring drip water, color coded by collection site. And then these dark lines are our PCP, model PCP vectors. Our dashed line here is the theoretical calcite recrystallization vector. We can do the same thing for barium and strontium. And it's clear that this is not a super straightforward thing that's going on, right? We have, potentially steeper slopes or multiple slopes. If you look over at the barium plot, it seems like, some of these actually fall on lines parallel at the same slope as the PCP slope, but there's lots of different lines. If we look at a time series of the data, here we've got our effective rainfall. Our barium calcium, is pretty consistent between drip sites, but our strontium and magnesium really aren't. And in fact, in the later part of the data set, there's very distinct means for the different drip sites and their strontium calcium ratios. And in particular, this area here, leading up to about September 2015, we see large variations that aren't consistent at all drip site to drip site. And this is a period of time where we had, pretty big changes in effective rainfall. To dig into that a little bit further, we can separate the data out by time. And here we've got before September 2015, so including that kind of wonky zone, and then after September 2015. And now we've got linear regressions through different drip sites. So you can see at an individual site, with magnesium, we have slopes approaching the PCP slopes, but not so much in our diffuse fed drip sites, these circle points here. In barium, in the early data set, it looks very different. But then as you get into the more recent data, we really do see these separate parallel slopes broken out by drip site within the cave. And you can take a look at the distributions in a box plot as well, where we can see this is all strontium data, and there really does seem to be separate populations, like different baseline values of strontium at each of these drip sites. Okay, so we approached the model in a similar way, beginning with the batch dissolution experiment, where we had also collected data on strontium and magnesium as this limestone was dissolving. Here you see the orange line is our rate model. And, we did have some evidence for very early high magnesium values in the earliest samples from the dissolution experiment. And we did a little bit of digging into the limestone characteristics. This cave is hosted in the Montego limestone. It's a Mississippian oolitic skeletal grainstone and packstone, with the skeletal fragments mostly being echinoderms and bryozoans. And echinoderms are high mag calcite, which can dissolve faster than low mag calcite. So we did some experiments adding in the model a very reactive high mag phase, and didn't really see that it influenced the model results very significantly. However, we also noted in the literature that there's evidence of diagenetic dolomite and celestite in this limestone. So we'll kind of put a pin in that for the future here. Here are our 1D model results. So in the top panels, you see calcium and radiocarbon. So this is the same thing that I was showing you previously at our different PCO2s and flow rates. And at the bottom here, you have magnesium calcium ratios. And we have a huge range, as you saw, in the drip water magnesium calcium and strontium calcium that actually extends well beyond what you have in the x-axis of these graphs. So, we do have some simulations that give us the proper magnesium calcium, strontium calcium, but we have much higher numbers than we're able to achieve with the model as it is at the moment. We can look at this in another way. So here we've got our magnesium calcium versus strontium calcium plot and our data. These dots and this line are our 9 simulations of different PCO2s and flow rates. So you can see we are plotting in the neighborhood of some of our numbers here, but we have much higher strontium and magnesium than we can achieve in the model with just dissolution of limestone. So if we take that water as it emerges from the epikarst and we allow it to precipitate pure calcium carbonate, the remaining drip water will fall along this line. So we do enrich it in magnesium and strontium, and we do get into some of the neighborhood of the measurements that we're getting in the cave drip waters. Now, this may not be the chemistry of the phase that's precipitating. So we also measured the trace element values of a stalagmite from this cave that we've collected and allowed the model to precipitate a carbonate that had that range of values as well. So that you see here, and these lines could really extend from any of these points. But you get the idea, this does raise us in both strontium and magnesium space a little bit, but it doesn't quite explain these very high strontium numbers that we're seeing. So then we kind of went back to the drawing board and thought, well, what can we possibly add to this model that would raise the strontium? And remembered, right, that we have this report of diagenetic celestite from the literature. So we tried adding a celestite phase into the model. And here's what we got when we do that. So these are at 3 different flow rates, fast, medium, and slow. And you can see that we are able to raise the strontium value of our drip water by including this reactive celestite phase. So this gets us into the neighborhood of the strontium that we are measuring in this cave system. Now we can take a look in the same way at the barium. So now we've got strontium calcium versus barium calcium. Here are our reactive transport models, just the dissolution. And here is our vector for precipitation of pure calcium carbonate. So you see with the barium, we are also too low in the strontium and we're too high with the barium in the model based on what we've measured in the drip water. If we add that celestite phase in at these 3 different drip rates, we definitely get into the neighborhood where we want to be with many of the drip measurements in terms of strontium calcium. For barium, we tried a number of different things. There isn't a lot of barium in the limestone, so we were pretty constrained in terms of the changes we could make to the phases that we're dissolving. And ultimately, we landed on the hypothesis that we think that the barium coming in from our soil boundary condition is too high. It's based on what we've measured in our lysimeter, but quite possibly that's just not what's making it into the drip water. So if we lower the barium for our initial condition, then we get into the neighborhood of where we want to be for all of our drip waters. And this is very broken out by drip site. These sites out here that have much higher strontium, this is the site BSW12, which is all the way at the back of our cave. These 2 sites, BSW 4 and 10, are next. These sites are all located in this other room that's up a very steep climb from that BSW 4 and 10. And you can imagine if we added more celestite or we slowed down the flow rate, we would match these different drip sites. So this really suggests that there's a strong spatial control on the strontium in our drip water, which we may not have uncovered if we hadn't sampled so widely. If we go back to our time series, here again, we've got this very consistent barium measurement throughout the cave. And we do see some response to effective rainfall. We have higher values during periods of low effective rainfall. And this suggests to me that, if we were going to use a speleothem from this cave to make paleoclimate inferences, our barium calcium might be our best proxy for prior calcite precipitation and aridity. If we hadn't done this study and we're using strontium and magnesium, we might not realize that there is this heterogeneity in the host rock that is going to add another influence to our proxy records. So our take-home messages in particular are that monitoring at sites across a cave is essential in order to understand all of the influential parameters at your site. And then in particular, if you're developing a speleothem record, understanding the flow in your room of the cave or at your site of speleothem collection is very important. And then the very big take-home message is that reactive transport models, such as this one, can really help you try to disentangle all of the influences on your drip water chemistry and help us try to crack open that black box of the epikarst a little bit. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
All right, it looks like questions have started appearing. So the first question is from Lee Floria. He says, at Blue Spring and other sites, landowners have presented challenges because of their social and political positions. This is something that I have also experienced in my research in Kentucky and Indiana. As scientists supporting the DEI goals of the Carbonate Critical Zone RCN, how do we navigate these sorts of landowner issues while engaging diverse students and still supporting an anti-racist and more diverse cave research community?
That is an excellent question. I moved here from California, and I was part of the San Francisco Bay Grotto, which was a very science-friendly, very open group of cavers, while I was there. And there were many, many people who were interested in the research I was doing and who wanted to participate. And since coming to Tennessee, it's been a different experience. I've given talks at our local chapter, and been asked some questions that I wasn't surprised by, but I tried to answer as honestly as I could. I think that the more we can get out and speak to people, about climate science, about this kind of science, the better. And with Blue Spring, it is a privately owned. The landowner has been pretty helpful. There are a number of different people who go and cave there. And I have taken lots of different students of many different backgrounds caving at this cave. And, we've always felt safe, but we've tried to be very visible and very honest about what we're doing and talk to whoever we encounter. And, I've tried to be mindful of the experiences of my students. And I think, getting out there, doing science, communicating with the landowner what we're doing, and demonstrating to him the value of the work in this particular case has been helpful, but it is not easy in every place and kind of an uphill battle. I agree.
Okay, we have another question from John Martin. So he says he has to leave soon, but wants to quickly get in this question. He's curious if you've considered the potential for back reactions, including precipitation of barite from celestite dissolution and SO4 production. I think barite is much more insoluble than celestite.
That's very interesting. We haven't explored that yet, but I think that's definitely something that we could take a look at in the model. I mean, we were really struggling to figure out what was giving us these kind of strontium numbers. And the celestite phase is a solution that seems to work, but it doesn't mean it's the solution, and it's something that we're continuing to explore, both through the model and through observations in the cave system.
Okay, and another one from Renee Price. So your one-dimensional transport models seem to reach equilibrium within a short vertical distance, say 2 to 4 meters. Can you speak to that fast equilibrium?
Yeah, I mean, and I should mention, Jenny is also on this call. And Jenny, if anytime you would like to jump in, I would love it, because this work is definitely a collaboration with both of us. The water comes in from the epikarst very reactive with CO2. And because of that, it reacts with the limestone very quickly and reaches equilibrium fairly quickly. And Jenny, is there anything you would like to add there?
That's exactly right. The only thing I'll add is that, the kinetics of the limestone dissolution, which would govern basically the speed at which we approach that equilibrium, are calibrated off of the laboratory reactions that we did. with that limestone. So we're entirely predicating this on the idea that what we were able to constrain from this particular limestone in the laboratory is then applicable to the field. And of course, we've made adjustments for changes in reactive mineral surface area and such, but nonetheless, with that CO2 charged soil water entering the limestone, you equilibrate quite quickly.
I actually have a couple of questions which are more related to the model, and maybe they're more questions for Jenny. But in that dissolution model, are you making any assumptions about the impact of flow rates on dissolution, or are you presuming that it's all controlled by diffusion rates to and from the surface, or surface reaction rates, or are there any assumptions there?
So the simulations that Jessica showed, we showed 3 representative flow rates, which essentially spanned a sensitivity analysis for how fluid infiltration rate is impacting that depth and time of reactivity. Are you speaking to
I'm
something?
talking about on the actual kinetics. I mean, on the rate at which calcite is dissolving away from the surface, or minerals are dissolving away from the surface.
Well, it's a reactive transport model, so that every single time step includes advection, diffusion, and reaction, right? So if you have the same reaction rate and you speed up flow, you're going to take further into the domain to hit the same concentration. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Maybe we can talk about it later at a later time. I'm not sure I completely understand, but I think there are more questions which we can continue on to. And Rachel Bosch, who's also involved with KWI, is going to be helping me with this. So.
Okay, hi there. We have a question from Yuval Burston, who says, great talk, and agrees that trace elements are complicated, and asks if you consider Wassenberg's latest paper about strontium and magnesium's effect on deuterium, I'm guessing. Another idea I've been toying with is strontium and barium affected by vegetation, as they are micronutrients. And Yuval is wondering if that's ever been tested.
Yeah. So I agree. I don't think I've ever actually worked in a cave where I had nice PCP vectors in my speleothem records. I kind of always have some dolomite or something that's making things interesting. We did not. So yeah, so that's the DSR is the partition coefficient of the strontium into calcite. We didn't really play with that at all, but it's a good thing to look at. I think that we found that the range that we were seeing in the strontium like really required kind of a big change, like something that we couldn't quite get at by playing with what was precipitating. But I think taking a look at the partition coefficients would be an interesting next step. And as far as the soil, that is something, so thinking about how the barium that we were measuring in the soil doesn't seem to match what's making it through in the limestone. Thinking about effects of vegetation on that, and like how barium moves through the soil and into the epikarst, I think would be, is something I've been thinking about, haven't really implemented yet, but definitely something to explore further, both in our measurements and in the model.
Are we doing verbal questions too?
Yeah, we can do that as well if you want to ask one, Lee.
Okay, this is Lee. Hey, I got a question about barium. Less information about strontium. It's not really my thing, but with regards to barium, not too far north of you, where I'm working in southern Kentucky, the Pennington has a fairly thick limestone lens near the base that has really big barite nodules. And I don't know what, if any, influence that might have. There is a sandstone that separates it from the Bangor, and then you got the Hartzell in the way. But I don't know if there's like a gradient of your barium because of like the thickness of the overlying strata, and whether it encounters the Pennington along the way or not.
Yeah, there are a number of like little limestone units that are in that region. I mean, we've looked at the soil above the cave is actually fairly thick, you know, for compared to other karst environments I've worked in, and it's very clay rich. So I think there's, you know, there's other things contributing to it, and you know, there's an interesting mineralogy to the soil. So I think the barium coming from something weathering into the soil makes sense to me. But yeah, looking more into these other limestone units, I think, and what they've got in them is an interesting thing to do. Thank you.
No, thanks, appreciate it.
So I'll ask my other question about the model, which so with the carbon story, you couldn't reproduce the observed ranges without, if I understood it, it was basically cranking up the diffusivity or something like that. And I'm curious whether advection of gases might actually be part of the story of what's going on there. Is there any advection of gases in the model, or is it purely diffusive?
So thank you for that opportunity to clarify. In these reactive transport models, they're typically built with the intent of treating porous media, right? That a lot of them come from contaminant hydrology. And so, you know, we're starting to push these simulation platforms into new places and new applications, and that's really exciting. And so when we crank up the diffusivity of the gas, I want to be clear that what we're doing is taking it from a tortuosity corrected diffusion coefficient, which is inherently much lower than the diffusion coefficient in this room for gas, because, you know, we're typically working in porous media. And it honestly took me a long time to be like, wait a minute, this isn't porous media, this is a fracture. And so when we take that diffusion coefficient up, all I'm doing is taking it closer to the free air diffusion coefficient. I'm not treating it as some kind of free parameter that can go to some crazy high value. Now, when I take it up to something closer to a free air diffusion coefficient, meaning it's not artificially reduced as though it were in a tortuous porous media, then we get good agreement. So on that basis, I did not see justification to add the additional parameterization that would be necessary to describe gas advection. We could do so, but I have no idea what that velocity would be or even how to treat it. So I'd always try to err on the side of not adding more parameters unless that's necessary.
We have another question in the chat. This is coming from Georgina Lukowski. I hope I pronounced your name right. And the question pertains to whether any possible barite deposits in central Tennessee might in some way affect the geochemistry that you are observing.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's something that we can also take a look at. I mean, what we've noticed is that there's like way more barium in the soil water than what we see in the cave. So I guess the questions are, yeah, where is that barium coming from, but also why isn't it, you know, making it into the drip water and into the cave? And what's the, you know, what is a good starting point for what's actually advecting in? I've learned a lot about the complexities of these limestones and these limestone units. And I will certainly look into the presence of barite deposits.
I have a follow-up question to that, and I may have misunderstood Georgina's question, but in Southern Kentucky and Indiana, we've been seeing some evidence for deep fluid emplacement of like fluorite. Sometimes in Kentucky, we actually found some copper minerals in calcite bugs. And our work is still pretty preliminary, but in Indiana, we found strontium enrichment associated with reduced sulfur signals. And I was wondering what sort of, and I know this is more of a drip water epikarst scenario, but is there a chance for those sort of signals to show up in that record?
Yeah, I mean, clearly clearly there's complexity in the host rock that does seem to influence the drip water. And it does, I mean, our based on the literature, right, our hypothesis is that it has to do with this diagenesis and changes in the host rock based on that. So it could be it could be a number of things. I mean, I have analyzed small pieces of the host rock petrographically and by laser ablation, and not seen evidence in the pieces that we had, right? And our dissolution experiment of our limestone did not turn this up. So what we've done is basically looked broadly at the literature and used that of this particular limestone unit, and use that to kind of, you know, see, well, if we do this with the model, does this help make sense? So it certainly could be these other phases. It could be a not celestite, but some other strontium related phase that could be influencing it. Yeah.
Sure, that makes sense. I guess the thing that really sparked that thought in my head was in your talk, you mentioned that the strontium was localized, and those sorts of things can be very fracture oriented, localized things. Signals.
Okay. Yeah. That's great. I definitely take a look at that.
Great.
Okay, we just got another question in from Uroš Novak. He says, just a reminder, but I'm sure you know this, barite and celestite are often associated with each other in the mineral paragenesis, especially in Mississippi Valley type ore genesis, lead zinc ore veins and limestones. I'm not familiar with Eastern US regional geology. I don't know, is this near any of the MVT deposits? They're not too far away, are they?
I'm sorry, near any of the what?
The Mississippi Valley type lead zinc deposits.
Oh, I don't know, but
Yeah, that's I'm sorry. That's what my question was getting at.
Okay.
There is economic. Sorry, can you hear me? There is economically mined lead zinc in Goodlettsville, which is in the Nashville dome, but not very far from you. So it's quite possible that you might have enhanced mineralization from some structural influence there. And, you know, we're happy to chat with you about that. We don't, like Sarah was saying, you know, some of the stuff is preliminary both in Indiana and Tennessee, but there is quite a bit of overlapping geology between the two. And I think that there might be some of those same things happening with what you have.
okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we aren't in the Nashville area. When the cave is up on the Cumberland, the ridge of the Cumberland Plateau. But yeah, I would love to talk more about potential sources and influences on the strip water.
Okay, we may have reached the end of our questions. Well, thanks again, Jessica, for a really interesting talk, and thanks to everyone for the discussion, which was also interesting. And we'll hope to see you guys next semester when we kick off the next one of these talks.
Thank you all for having me. Thanks, Jenny, for jumping in on the questions. And hi, John Tinsley. I see you there.
Yeah, hi, John.
Thanks for the Bay chapter plug.
Right.
I was also once a Bay chapter member.
Indeed you were.
Well, thank you all for this opportunity. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.